You're a burden. I sold Dad's company. Good luck paying rent, my son said, his voice sharp enough to slice through the quiet of the dining room. I didn't argue. I didn't flinch. I simply pushed my chair back, stood up, and walked away, letting the weight of his words follow me down the hall like a shadow. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and let me know where you're watching from. The house still smelled faintly of my late husband's aftershave, even though it had been months since he passed. Some mornings, I thought I could hear him humming in the kitchen the way he used to while scrambling eggs. But today, all I heard was silence, the kind that settles in after someone says something they can never take back. I found myself standing by the window, the evening sun stretching long lines across the hardwood floor. This room used to feel warm. Now it felt unfamiliar, as if the home I'd tended for decades no longer recognized me. The mahogany table where birthdays and anniversaries once unfolded had become a battleground after my husband died. My son and his wife had begun treating it like a conference space rather than a family table. I remembered the days when my husband and I would sit for hours talking about our future. He always reassured me that the company he built, brick by brick, year by year, would keep me comfortable for the rest of my life. You'll never have to worry, he used to say, resting his hand over mine. I believed him. I trusted that the life we built together would be respected. But grief changes people, and sometimes it reveals who they always were. My son barely looked at me anymore. His eyes had a different shine, cold, calculating, impatient, as if every word I spoke cost him something he didn't want to give. His wife wasn't any softer. She hovered behind him during our conversations like a quiet echo of disapproval, whispering thoughts into his ear that I could never quite hear but always felt. I caught myself brushing dust from the windowsill, a habit I'd developed since the funeral. I kept cleaning things that didn't need cleaning, straightening objects already in place, anything to distract my hands from trembling. I didn't cry. That part of me had gone quiet the day I stood alone at my husband's graveside, listening to strangers tell stories about him while my own son checked his phone. Something had shifted after we lowered the casket. My son stopped coming by unless paperwork needed signing. My daughter-in-law started rearranging the house as if she owned it, moving my husband's belongings into boxes without asking, changing passwords, redirecting mail. At first, I thought it was grief, taking the lead. Then I realized it was strategy. Tonight was simply the first time he said the quiet part out loud, burden. The word lingered, not because it hurt, though it did, but because it told me everything I needed to know. My son wasn't mourning his father. He wasn't grieving with me. He was calculating his next move. And yet, as I stood at the window, I felt something unexpected. Clarity. The kind that comes when the storm finally settles enough for you to see the damage. I inhaled slowly, let the breath out, and looked around the house my husband and I had built together over decades. Every photo frame, every scuff on the floor, every faded curtain held a memory. Nothing about this place said burden. Nothing about my life said empty. The only thing that felt heavy was the realization of how far my son had drifted, or maybe how far he'd always been. I didn't go back to the dining room. I didn't ask him why. I didn't plead or protest. I simply stood there in the soft glow of the fading daylight and understood something essential. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a truth I had ignored for too long. The night after that dinner, the house felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what I would do next. I moved quietly from room to room, turning off lights I barely remembered turning on. My footsteps echoed in the hall, a reminder of how different life had become since my husband passed. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised. Just aware in a way I hadn't been before. The kitchen still held the faint warmth of the meal I never finished. 2 plates sat on the counter, one empty, one untouched. I ran my fingers along the cool porcelain, remembering how my husband used to tap his fork twice before taking his first bite. A small habit, steady and reassuring. It was strange how a person's absence could fill a room more than their presence ever did. Upstairs, the bedroom waited in its quiet stillness. His side of the closet remained exactly as he left it, jackets hanging in neat rows, shoes aligned with care. I used to find comfort in that order. Now, it felt like a paused life, No one wanted to acknowledge. My son hadn't stepped foot in this room since the funeral. He avoided memories the way some people avoided the cold, by shutting doors and refusing to look back. I sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing the quilt I had stitched decades ago. My hands moved automatically, following patterns I knew by heart. That quilt had traveled through years of joy, loss, and rebuilding. It had been with us through snowstorms, birthdays, and the quiet mornings when my husband would bring me coffee before heading to work. He always believed the company would provide for us, that our son would grow into a man capable of honoring it. He never imagined those words, "You're a burden," would come from the same mouth he once held against his chest as a newborn. The next morning, the house felt colder. Not from the weather, but from the shift in how my son and his wife moved through it. They walked with purpose, whispering in corners, avoiding my eyes as if seeing me might disrupt their plans. My daughter-in-law barely acknowledged me when she passed through the living room. She glanced toward my husband's study, the one she had quietly started calling the business room, as though she already owned it. I made myself a cup of tea and carried it to the sunroom. The air was crisp, the kind that made the early light shimmer across the windows. I watched the neighborhood wake up, dog walkers, joggers, a man scraping frost from his windshield. Ordinary moments, steady and predictable. A contrast to the shift happening inside my own home. My son finally appeared in the doorway, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed anywhere but on me. "We should talk later," he said, as if he hadn't shattered something the night before. His voice had that same flat tone people use when delivering news they don't plan to discuss. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I'd learned that silence often revealed more than confrontation ever could. After he left, I stared into my cooling tea and let the quiet settle around me. The distance between us wasn't new. It had been growing since the funeral, but last night had pulled back whatever veil I'd been clinging to. He didn't see me as support, as family, or even as someone worthy of basic respect. He saw me as an obstacle, something in the way. Still, I didn't cry. I didn't crumble. Instead, I listened, to the quiet corners of the house, to the faint creaking of the stairs, to the echo of the life I once had. Grief had carved out space in me, yes, but behind that space, something steadier had begun to form. Not anger, not revenge, awareness, and a calm I couldn't fully explain. Because now I knew, when people show you what they think you're worth, you don't argue with them. You watch, you wait, and you remember. Morning arrived with a thin layer of frost on the yard, glimmering under the pale light. I watched it from the kitchen window as I warmed my hands around a mug of tea. The house was unusually quiet for that hour. My son and his wife were already awake. I could hear their muted voices drifting from the hallway earlier, but the silence now felt deliberate, as if they had paused their conversation the second they realized I was nearby. It wasn't new. They had been doing that more often lately. I walked into the dining room and noticed something strange immediately. A stack of documents on the table, half covered by my daughter-in-law's silk scarf. I didn't touch anything, but I stood close enough to recognize my husband's handwriting printed on the folder labels. My chest tightened, not from fear, but from the familiarity of seeing his name reduced to paperwork. I heard footsteps behind me, and my daughter-in-law swooped in like a gust of wind. "Oh, those are nothing," she said quickly, pulling the papers toward her. She didn't meet my eyes. "Just some household things." Household things. That was her new phrase for anything she didn't want me to question. I simply nodded and stepped aside. She relaxed too quickly, confirming exactly what I suspected. There was something in that stack she didn't want me to see. Later, my son came into the room, his phone in hand, shoulders tense. "We need to talk about bills," he said. Not hello, not even a glance to check if I was all right. Just bills. "I've been managing them for decades," I replied softly. He exhaled sharply, the way people do when they're trying to stay patient. "Things are changing, Mom. You can't handle everything anymore." It wasn't the words, it was the tone. Detached. Clinical. As if he were delivering a report about a stranger. He walked away before I could answer, joining his wife in the study. The door closed behind them with a click that carried more weight than it should have. I stayed in the hallway a moment longer, listening. I didn't hear full sentences, just fragments, rushed and hushed. transfer, deadline. She doesn't need to know. Each word dropped like a pebble into a lake, creating ripples that stretched wider the more I stood there. I returned to the living room, sitting where the morning sun reached the old armchair. I felt the warmth on my hands, steady and patient. It reminded me of my husband sitting across from me during slow weekends, tapping his pen against his notebook while planning new projects. He never hid anything from me. Not once. The contrast made the silence heavier. As the hours passed, I noticed more small changes, details I might have ignored before. My keys weren't where I left them. A drawer I rarely opened was slightly ajar. My husband's briefcase, usually resting under the coat rack, had been moved into the study without my knowledge. When I tried the doorknob, it didn't turn. Locked. The study had never been locked in this house. Not once in all the years we lived here. I stood there a full minute, feeling the weight of that locked door. It wasn't about privacy. It was about exclusion, about being quietly pushed out of rooms that once belonged equally to both of us. After lunch, my son finally reappeared, rubbing the back of his neck. "Mom," he said, not meeting my eyes, "you should really think about downsizing. This house is too much for you now. Too much." A gentle phrase with a sharp edge. He walked away again before I could respond. I sat in the living room as the afternoon light shifted across the floorboards, stretching long shadows toward my feet. I followed them with my eyes, thinking about everything that had unfolded since my husband's funeral. The whispers, the paperwork moved around, the cold glances replaced with careful avoidance. None of it felt accidental. And while I didn't have answers yet, I did have something stronger: attention. Every detail settled into place, forming the outline of something I couldn't quite see but could definitely feel. They thought I wasn't aware. They thought I wasn't paying attention. But I was. I always had been. And now, more than ever, I knew I needed to be. The afternoon stretched on, quiet and slow, the kind of quiet that makes every sound sharper. I walked into the living room and paused in front of the framed photo of my husband, the one from our 25th anniversary. His arm around my shoulders, his smile calm and steady. The same smile that carried us through storms we never spoke about outside our home. I traced the edge of the frame with my thumb, remembering how he used to reassure me whenever life wavered. "As long as we stand together," he'd say, "nothing can shake us." But now I was standing alone, and the ground beneath me felt different. I sank into the armchair he loved, the leather soft and worn from years of his presence. The room felt smaller somehow since he'd gone, like the air had less warmth without his voice filling it. I could almost see him there, sorting through papers, tapping his reading glasses against his chin as he thought through a problem. He always invited me into those decisions. He cared what I thought, what I felt. My son didn't inherit that. Not the patience, not the steadiness, not the loyalty. I closed my eyes and let the memories come. The long drives we used to take in the fall, stopping at roadside cafes for pie and coffee. The nights he'd return late from work, but still sit beside me on the sofa just to ask how my day had been. The mornings when he'd bring in the newspaper and read the business section aloud, promising that one day the company would support us long after he stepped away from it. He meant it. I never doubted that, which made the present even harder to swallow. The company he built wasn't just a business. It was years of sacrifice, nights he barely slept, weekends spent in his small office drafting proposals. And now it had been sold behind my back, without a single conversation, without even the courtesy of acknowledgement. I opened the drawer of the side table and pulled out his old planner. The leather cover was cracked with age, the corners rounded from use. Inside were notes from years ago, meetings, reminders, small scribbles he made to himself. But between those pages were pieces of us, a grocery list he wrote when I was sick, a note that said, "Anniversary dinner, don't forget flowers," and a page where he'd outlined how he planned to transfer the company to our son one step at a time. He had written in the margin, "She'll never have to worry. Not as long as I'm here." A soft ache spread through my chest, not from sadness this time, but from realization. He had trusted our son to protect what he built. He had believed in a version of him that no longer existed. I placed the planner back into the drawer and sat quietly for a moment, letting the silence steady me. The house creaked as the temperature dropped outside. Somewhere down the hall, I heard my daughter-in-law's laughter. Sharp, hurried, almost triumphant. It didn't belong in this house. Not in the echo of what once was. I rose and walked toward the stairs, my fingers brushing the banister he polished every spring. At the top, I paused at the doorway to the study, the locked study. Behind that door was the life he'd worked for, the legacy he intended to leave with honor. I rested my hand on the cool metal of the doorknob, understanding now that the door wasn't locked to protect me from anything. It was locked to keep me out. I stepped back slowly, breathing in the quiet, letting it settle around me like a thin blanket. I wasn't confused anymore. And I wasn't naive. This wasn't grief. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was intention. And as I walked back down the stairs, steady and slow, I felt something shift inside me. A certainty forming quietly, like a thread pulling tight. They weren't just changing things. They were rewriting a future that was never theirs to rewrite. That evening, just before the sun dipped behind the trees, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. My son and his wife were upstairs, too busy whispering behind the locked study door to notice the sound. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and went to open it. Standing there was someone I hadn't seen in months. Mark, my husband's longtime friend and the man who had served as his accountant for nearly 20 years. His hair had more gray in it now, but his eyes carried the same steady warmth I remembered. He held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly, the way people do when they're unsure how to begin. "Evening, ma'am," he said softly. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You're not," I replied, stepping aside. "Come in." He hesitated at the threshold, glancing up the stairs, listening to the distant murmur of voices. Only after a moment did he walk in, as if confirming it was safe to speak. I guided him to the living room. The leather chair creaked under his weight as he sat, still holding his hat in both hands. "I should have come sooner," he began. "I've been concerned." Concerned. A word that felt both heavy and gentle. He looked around the room, noticing the planner still on the side table, the framed anniversary photo, the quiet pieces of my husband's life that remained scattered like breadcrumbs. "I came across something," he said, lowering his voice. "Something I thought you should know." My heart didn't race. It didn't even stutter. It simply waited. He pulled a folded envelope from his coat pocket, its edges creased from being handled too many times. "Your husband left notes with me. Instructions, really, about the company, what was to happen if anything ever happened to him." I kept my hands still on my lap. "Your son and his wife have been contacting people," he continued. "Clients, partners, acting as if they have full control. And well, that alarmed me. Upstairs, I heard the faint closing of a door. Quick, hurried. Maybe they had heard a voice they didn't expect. Maybe that was for the best. Mark leaned forward, lowering his voice even further. "Your husband trusted you. He made that very clear. He didn't intend for decisions to be made without you. But lately there have been documents filed, documents with your signature on them." I looked at him, expression steady. "My signature?" "Yes," he said, "but not your hand." The room felt still, like the air itself was listening. "I shouldn't say more without showing you," he murmured. But I couldn't sit by any longer. Not when I knew something wasn't right. Outside, a car drove by, its headlights sweeping across the curtains before disappearing. The quiet returned, heavier than before. "You're not alone in this," he said gently. "And you're not imagining things." I nodded, a small and slow gesture, but it carried the weight of recognition. Everything I had sensed, every shift, every whisper, every locked drawer, wasn't paranoia. It was pattern, purpose. Mark stood, placing the envelope carefully on the table beside the planner. "Read this when you're ready," he said. As I walked him to the door, he paused on the porch and looked back at me with something close to sorrow. "He respected you more than anyone," he said. "And he wanted you protected." When he left, I remained at the doorway for a long moment, watching the taillights fade down the street. The house behind me hummed with distant footsteps, quick, anxious, purposeful. I closed the door slowly, the click of the lock echoing through the quiet hall. Someone had finally said it out loud. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't losing control. I wasn't the burden. And now that the truth had a witness, the ground beneath their plans was beginning to crack. Night settled over the house like a heavy blanket, quiet but tense, the kind of quiet that follows a truth finally spoken aloud. I sat at the dining table long after Mark left, the envelope resting beside my hand. I didn't open it yet. I didn't need the details to understand what it meant. His visit had confirmed everything I'd been sensing in the shadows of this house, and now the shadows felt sharper. Upstairs, footsteps moved back and forth, quick, stiff, restless. They must have seen his car or heard his voice. My son didn't come downstairs, and neither did his wife. They were talking, I was sure of it, but the walls kept their secrets. The house had grown practiced at silence lately. I slid the envelope closer and finally unfolded it. Inside were photocopies of documents bearing my husband's name, the company's letterhead, and signatures, 2 of them mine, except they weren't. The loops were too wide, the slant too stiff, the pressure too hard. My real signature always drifted upward, gentle, almost soft. This one looked forced, and someone had forced it. I set the papers down, smoothing them with my fingertips. My husband used to bring contracts home for me to review. He'd sit beside me, explain every line with patience. "We do this together," he'd say, "always together." The contrast between that memory and the forgeries in front of me felt like stepping from warm sunlight into cold water. I heard the study door open upstairs, then close again. A couple of hurried whispers followed, then quiet. My daughter-in-law's footsteps clicked down the hallway, sharp and irritated, before fading into their bedroom. My son didn't come down. He hadn't looked me in the eyes properly in weeks. I stood and walked into the kitchen, turning on the small lamp by the sink. Its soft glow spread across the counter, touching the familiar shapes of mugs, jars, and the wooden cutting board my husband carved years ago. Everything in this room carried memories of the life we built, slow, steady, honest. I poured myself a glass of water, the sound gentle in the stillness. My hands weren't shaking. They felt steadier than they had in days. Knowing the truth has a way of stabilizing a person, even when the truth hurts. I walked toward the back door and looked out at the yard lit by the porch light. The air was cold, but the night held a strange kind of clarity. I remembered my husband planting the oak tree by the fence, saying it would outlive both of us. He was right. Its branches stretched proudly upward, untouched by the chaos inside this house. When I returned to the dining room, I gathered the envelope, the papers, and my husband's planner from the side table. I placed them neatly inside a drawer that only I used. I didn't lock it. I didn't need to. Let them wonder what I knew. Let them feel the uncertainty they'd tried to sow in me. As I closed the drawer, I heard my son coming downstairs. His steps were slow, hesitant. He appeared in the doorway, eyes avoiding mine, shoulders tight with whatever conversation he just had upstairs. "Mom, did someone come by earlier?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Yes," I replied. "Nothing more." He swallowed hard, nodded once, and looked toward the drawer without meaning to. The flicker in his eyes told me everything. He knew the truth was slipping out of his hands. "Okay," he muttered, backing away. "Just checking." He disappeared up the stairs again, leaving the air thinner than before. I stood alone in the dim dining room, lit by one small lamp, the house settling into its night creaks. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for months felt different now. Not gone, but transformed. I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't guessing. I wasn't waiting for kindness that wasn't coming. I knew exactly what was happening, and knowing meant I could finally decide what to do next. Morning came with a thin gray light, barely slipping through the blinds, the kind of morning that felt cautious, as if the day itself wasn't sure it should begin. I moved quietly through the kitchen, my slippers brushing against the tile, the familiar scent of coffee filling the air. My hands worked from habit, scoop, pour, stir, while my mind replayed the sound of my son's hesitant voice from the night before. He knew something was shifting. And for the first time in months, I wasn't the one afraid of that shift. I sat at the small breakfast table, the one my husband and I used to share on slow weekends, steam rising from the mug between my palms. The house was still, but not peacefully so. It was the stillness of people awake upstairs, waiting, whispering, planning. My son finally came down, each step measured, like he was testing the ground before placing his weight. He didn't look rested. He looked cornered. His eyes avoided mine as he reached for a glass, filling it halfway with water he didn't drink. "Morning," he muttered. I nodded. Silence stretched between us, not awkward, not tense, simply revealing. That's what silence does when people run out of stories to cover their tracks. He cleared his throat. We might need you to sign a couple things today. There it was, the next move. He tried to keep his voice steady, but I heard the strain beneath it. He wasn't good at hiding nerves. Even when he was little, he'd tug at the hem of his shirt whenever he lied. This morning, he kept adjusting the sleeve of his sweatshirt, pulling it down, smoothing it, pulling again. What kind of things? I asked, my tone calm enough to make him falter. Just updates, transfers, routine stuff. The kind of vague sentence people say when they hope you won't ask for details. Before I could answer, my daughter-in-law appeared in the doorway. Her smile was too quick, too practiced, like a hostess greeting an unwelcome guest. She placed her hand lightly on my son's arm, a signal, not affection. "We'll bring everything down later," she said. "It's nothing complicated." I watched her eyes flicker to the drawer where I'd placed the envelope. She caught herself and looked away just as fast. Guilt has its own body language, and she was fluent in it. I lifted my mug and took a slow sip. "I'll look them over," I said. Not yes, not no, just a small doorway for them to walk through, if they dared. She seemed dissatisfied with my answer, but she smiled anyway, tightening her grip on my son's arm before steering him back toward the stairs. Their voices carried faintly down the hallway, urgent, clipped, increasingly frustrated. After they disappeared, I rose from the table and walked to the window. Outside, the world looked brutally ordinary. Neighbors backing out of driveways, a jogger passing by. A squirrel darting along the fence line. All of life moving forward, while the truth inside this house grew heavier by the hour. My husband would have seen this coming. He always understood people better than they understood themselves. He used to say, "Pressure shows character," and pressure was showing mine and theirs. A soft knock broke the quiet. I turned to see my son again, lingering in the doorway like a boy caught doing something he shouldn't. He tried once more to sound casual. "Mom, did Dad ever tell you anything about the company plans? Before he passed?" I met his eyes, really met them, and in that moment I saw the truth he'd been avoiding. He wasn't asking for information. He was checking how much I knew. I set my mug down gently, letting the sound settle in the space between us. "He told me enough," I said. A simple sentence, but it landed like a stone dropped into still water. His face shifted, not dramatically, not theatrically, just a small tightening around the eyes, a swallow he couldn't disguise. He nodded once and left without another word. I stood alone in the kitchen, the morning light brightening by the minute, and felt something steady rise inside me. Not anger, not fear, readiness. They were moving fast, but I wasn't standing still. By late afternoon, the house felt charged, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I walked slowly toward the study, the locked study, and stood in front of the door. Sunlight filtered through the hallway window, catching the dust in the air like tiny sparks. I rested my hand on the cold metal knob, the same knob my husband touched thousands of times. Even without opening it, I could feel the shift behind that door. Papers moved, plans rewritten, a legacy twisted into something unrecognizable. I headed downstairs again, calm and deliberate. The folder they'd brought still sat on the dining table. I opened it once more, flipping through the pages with a steady hand. The forged signatures weren't the only problem. There were dates that didn't make sense, numbers that shifted without explanation, missing attachments my husband would never have overlooked. Every detail whispered the same truth. This wasn't clumsy. This was crafted. I reached for my husband's planner, opening it to the last few weeks before he passed. His handwriting filled the page. Careful, deliberate, familiar. He had outlined meetings, calls, a planned revision to the company charter, and there, tucked between notes, was a small sheet of paper folded neatly in half. I didn't remember seeing it before. Inside was a handwritten reminder in his unmistakable script. Review new ownership documents together. No signatures without both present. Together. Not him alone. Not me alone. Together. The simplicity of it tightened something in my chest. He had anticipated a transition, yes, but not one done in secret. Not one done by force. My fingers brushed the edge of the paper, and something slipped loose, a business card taped to the back. The name belonged to his attorney. Not the firm my son had begun working with, not the one handling the so-called transition. This was personal, someone he trusted. I hadn't called that number. Not yet. But seeing it now, tucked so carefully behind his note, felt like a quiet nudge from the past, a reminder he had left breadcrumbs not just for himself, but for me. Footsteps creaked above, my son's, heavy, uneven. He was pacing again. My daughter-in-law's sharper steps followed, a restless trail from bedroom to study and back. Something had unsettled them. Maybe my silence. Maybe my refusal to sign. Maybe the knowledge that someone, Mark, had come to speak to me. I slipped the planner and note into the drawer again, closing it softly. I didn't need confrontation. I didn't need raised voices or slamming doors. Quiet had always been my strength. People underestimate quiet. They think it means weakness, surrender, confusion. But quiet remembers. Quiet notices. Quiet prepares. A few minutes later, I heard them coming down the stairs together. Whispers first, then the soft thud of hesitant feet. My son appeared in the doorway, face pale, eyes darting to the folder as if waiting for it to explode. "Mom?" he started, voice thin. "We really need those signatures soon. It's urgent." "Urgent for whom?" "Urgent for what?" I didn't answer. I simply looked at him, letting the silence settle until he shifted under it. My daughter-in-law stood slightly behind him, her arms crossed tight against her chest. Not protective, defensive. "I'll sign what I understand," I said finally. "Nothing more." He swallowed. She frowned. The air tightened. Before either of them could respond, I added, "And I'll need time." Time wasn't what they wanted. Time meant questions. Time meant clarity. Time meant truth. I watched the realization flicker across both their faces like a light bulb flickering before it dies. My son nodded stiffly, trying to hide his frustration. "Fine, but soon." They left the room quickly, the tension trailing behind them like a draft. I sat back down, my hand resting on the closed folder. The forged signatures, the hidden documents, the locked study, the attorney's card, the whispered plans. Piece by piece, the truth was revealing itself, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. Quietly enough for me to hear every part of it, and I could feel it now. Clearly and fully, I had found the thread. And once you find the thread, pulling it is easy. By late afternoon, the house felt charged, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I walked slowly toward the study, the locked study, and stood in front of the door. Sunlight filtered through the hallway window, catching the dust in the air like tiny sparks. I rested my hand on the cold metal knob, the same knob my husband touched thousands of times. Even without opening it, I could feel the shift behind that door. Papers moved, plans rewritten. A legacy twisted into something unrecognizable. I headed downstairs again, calm and deliberate. The folder they'd brought still sat on the dining table. I opened it once more, flipping through the pages with a steady hand. The forged signatures weren't the only problem. There were dates that didn't make sense, numbers that shifted without explanation, missing attachments my husband would never have overlooked. Every detail whispered the same truth. This wasn't clumsy. This was crafted. I reached for my husband's planner, opening it to the last few weeks before he passed. His handwriting filled the page. Careful, deliberate, familiar. He had outlined meetings, calls, a planned revision to the company charter. And there, tucked between notes, was a small sheet of paper folded neatly in half. I didn't remember seeing it before. Inside was a handwritten reminder in his unmistakable script. Review new ownership documents together. No signatures without both present. Together. Not him alone. Not me alone. Together. The simplicity of it tightened something in my chest. He had anticipated a transition, yes, but not one done in secret. Not one done by force. My fingers brushed the edge of the paper and something slipped loose, a business card taped to the back. The name belonged to his attorney, not the firm my son had begun working with, not the one handling the so-called transition. This was personal, someone he trusted. I hadn't called that number, not yet. But seeing it now, tucked so carefully behind his note, felt like a quiet nudge from the past. A reminder he had left breadcrumbs not just for himself, but for me. Footsteps creaked above, my son's, heavy, uneven. He was pacing again. My daughter-in-law's sharper steps followed, a restless trail from bedroom to study and back. Something had unsettled them. Maybe my silence. Maybe my refusal to sign. Maybe the knowledge that someone, Mark, had come to speak to me. I slipped the planner and note into the drawer again, closing it softly. I didn't need confrontation. I didn't need raised voices or slamming doors. Quiet had always been my strength. People underestimate quiet. They think it means weakness, surrender, confusion. But quiet remembers. Quiet notices. Quiet prepares. A few minutes later, I heard them coming down the stairs together. Whispers first, then the soft thud of hesitant feet. My son appeared in the doorway, face pale, eyes darting to the folder as if waiting for it to explode. "Mom," he started, voice thin, "we really need those signatures soon. It's urgent." "Urgent for whom?" "Urgent for what?" I didn't answer. I simply looked at him, letting the silence settle until he shifted under it. My daughter-in-law stood slightly behind him, her arms crossed tight against her chest. Not protective, defensive. "I'll sign what I understand," I said finally. Nothing more. He swallowed. She frowned. The air tightened. Before either of them could respond, I added, "And I'll need time." Time wasn't what they wanted. Time meant questions. Time meant clarity. Time meant truth. I watched the realization flicker across both their faces like a light bulb flickering before it dies. My son nodded stiffly, trying to hide his frustration. Fine, but soon. They left the room quickly, the tension trailing behind them like a draft. I sat back down, my hand resting on the closed folder, the forged signatures, the hidden documents, the locked study, the attorney's card, the whispered plans. Piece by piece, the truth was revealing itself, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. Quietly enough for me to hear every part of it. And I could feel it now, clearly and fully. I had found the thread. And once you find the thread, pulling it is easy. The house dimmed into early evening, the light thinning into long strips across the floor. I sat at the dining table with the folder closed in front of me, the weight of it steady under my palm. Upstairs, the pacing had stopped. Their whispers had quieted. The house felt like it was waiting, watching, which meant it was finally my turn to move. I took out my husband's planner again, flipping to the back where the attorney's card was tucked. The imprint of the tape still clung to the edges. I traced the name with my thumb, remembering how my husband always said, "If anything happens, he's the one you call. He knows everything." I hadn't understood the importance of those words until now. I slipped the card into my pocket and stood. My steps were soft against the hardwood as I made my way to the hallway. Before leaving, I glanced toward the staircase, listening. Nothing. Not a footstep. Not a whisper. They were giving me space on purpose, hoping I'd use it to sign what they'd left. They didn't know I was using it for something else entirely. Outside, the air was crisp, brushing cool against my face. I walked down the driveway, steady and unhurried, as if going on a simple errand. The street was quiet, the sun dipping low. My husband used to say this hour made every decision feel clearer. Maybe that's why he liked sitting on the porch after work, thinking through the next day before it arrived. I reached the end of the driveway and called the number on the card. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered, calm and professional. "Ma'am, I wasn't expecting your call." "I know," I said, but I think my husband intended for this moment. A pause, not confusion, recognition. "I'll meet you first thing in the morning," he replied. "Bring any documents they've asked you to sign." "I will." "And ma'am, don't sign anything tonight." I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I wasn't planning to. When I hung up, I felt something settle inside me. Not peace, but certainty. The kind that comes when you finally stop doubting what you already knew. I walked back toward the house, the porch light flickering above the door. As I turned the knob, I heard movement inside. Quick, scrambling, like feet brushing against papers or doors being closed too fast. They were waiting for me to return, waiting to see if I had caved. I stepped into the foyer, hung my coat, and walked toward the dining room. The folder was still there, exactly where I left it. Untouched, but watched. My son appeared in the doorway moments later, trying to look casual. His eyes flicked to the table, then to me. "Did you look over the papers?" he asked, his tone careful. "I did," I said. "And?" He shifted his weight, hands shoved into his pockets. "I'll bring them to someone tomorrow," I replied. "Just to be sure everything is in order." His face changed. Not dramatically, but enough. A tightening around the jaw, a faint crease between his brows. The look of someone realizing time was no longer on their side. My daughter-in-law entered behind him, her smile thin and stiff. "We really hoped you'd trust us with this." "I do," I said, "but I trust clarity more." Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched thick with all the things they didn't want to admit. I moved past them, slow and calm, heading toward the staircase with the folder in hand. Their eyes followed every step I took. At the top of the stairs, I paused just long enough to say, "We'll talk after tomorrow." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. Just a fact. And facts have a way of landing harder than anything else. I went into my room and closed the door softly behind me. The house creaked around me, settling into its nighttime rhythm, unaware, or maybe very aware, that everything inside it was about to change. Tomorrow held answers. Tonight held preparation. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready for both. The morning arrived muted and pale, the kind of morning that feels suspended, quiet, waiting, aware. I dressed slowly, folding each sleeve with care, the way my husband used to before important meetings. The folder sat on my nightstand, its corners sharp against the wood. I picked it up, feeling the weight settle into my hand. Not heavy, just solid. True things often are. Downstairs, the house was still. Too still. My son and his wife were awake. I could feel it in the air, the way one feels a storm before it breaks. When I stepped into the dining room, they appeared almost instantly, as if they had been listening for my footsteps. "You're up early?" my son said, voice strained but trying for casual. His eyes were already on the folder. "I have somewhere to be," I replied, slipping on my coat. My daughter-in-law forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We can go over everything again if you need. Before you leave." "No," I said. "I'm fine." They both froze, not visibly, not dramatically, but in subtle shifts of posture. Shoulders tightening, eyes narrowing, breaths shortening. People reveal themselves in the little ways. "Mom," my son started, "we really need this handled quickly. If you take those documents out of the house." "I'm aware of what I'm taking," I said, a simple sentence, a quiet one. But it made them look at each other, a quick exchange full of panic they tried to hide. I walked toward the door, and they followed, too closely, too urgently. They weren't trying to escort me, they were trying to block the escape of something they no longer controlled. At the doorway, my son stepped ahead of me, one hand braced on the frame, not stopping me, not yet, just slowing me. "Why are you taking the papers?" he asked, his voice too tight. "You don't trust us?" I held his gaze, steady and calm. "I trust facts," his jaw clenched. His wife shifted beside him, arms crossed so tightly it looked painful. "And what exactly are you planning to do?" she demanded quietly. "Review what belongs to me," I answered. Another simple truth. Another truth they didn't expect. I stepped past them before either could argue. The cold air hit my face as I walked down the porch steps. For a moment, I thought they might follow me out, but they didn't. They stayed in the doorway, watching the folder in my hand like it was slipping through their fingers, which it was. I reached the end of the driveway when I heard the front door shut, harder than necessary. Their silhouettes passed by the window, moving quickly, anxiously, pacing like caged animals who suddenly realized the door to the cage had been unlocked without their permission. I kept walking. By the time I reached my car, the sun had cleared the edge of the trees. I opened the door and set the folder on the passenger seat. My hands never trembled. Not once. As I pulled out of the driveway, I caught a glimpse of them through the window. My son standing rigid, his wife gripping his arm, both of them staring at the empty driveway with expressions I had never seen on them before. Fear. Real fear. Not of losing me, but of losing what they thought they had taken. The drive was quiet, the world waking slowly around me. I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not even satisfaction, just a calm certainty. They had pushed. They had lied. They had forgotten who I was before grief softened me. Now they were about to remember. And I was only halfway through the driveway when I realized, for the first time since my husband died, I felt like I was standing on solid ground again. The attorney's office was warm, bright, and painfully honest in ways my own home hadn't been for months. I handed him the folder, the forged signatures, the strange transfers, the dates that didn't match. He read quietly, flipping each page with practiced eyes. Every few moments, his brow tightened, not in confusion, but in confirmation. When he finally looked up, he spoke gently. "Your husband protected you more than you know. These documents won't hold. You're still the legal majority owner, and any attempt to force your signature, real or fabricated, can be challenged immediately." I nodded once, the truth settling over me like a steadying hand. Not victorious, not triumphant, just right. He prepared the filings, the notices, the holds on accounts that had been tampered with. By the time I left his office, the foundation of everything my son and his wife had built in secret was already beginning to crumble. Quietly, efficiently, without a single raised voice. Driving home, the winter light hit the windshield in soft streaks, and for the first time since my husband passed, I didn't feel the weight of the empty seat beside me. I felt something closer to return, like a part of myself had found its way back. When I pulled into the driveway, they were waiting. My son stood on the porch, shoulders tight, face pale. My daughter-in-law hovered just behind him, arms crossed, eyes sharp with a panic she couldn't hide. He stepped forward. "Mom, we need to talk." I walked past them, calm, steady. "Yes," I said, "we do." Inside, the living room felt smaller with them standing there, crowded, defensive, shrinking under the kind of silence that makes truth visible. My son cleared his throat, searching for a version of the story that might save him. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he began. "No," I said softly. "There hasn't." His wife stiffened. My son's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked lost in a way that might have touched me once, but not today. "The company remains under my control," I continued. "The filings have been reviewed and corrected." His face drained, hers tightened into something sharp and brittle. "You went behind us?" she snapped. "No," I answered. "You went behind me." Silence fell again, thin, stretched, undeniable. My son's voice broke through it, smaller than I'd ever heard it. We thought." "I know what you thought," I said, "and I know what your father expected of you." I let the words settle, not as a weapon, but as truth. He trusted that you would protect what he built, not dismantle it. He looked down at the floor, his shoulders sagging, a weight finally landing where it belonged. My daughter-in-law stepped back, sensing the shift she couldn't control. "I'm not leaving this house," I said. "I'm not giving up what your father worked for, and I'm not signing anything I don't understand." He nodded slowly, shame creeping into the corners of his expression. I understand." But I wasn't speaking for his understanding. I was speaking to close the circle, to reclaim the ground I had quietly lost piece by piece. I turned toward the stairs, the soft creak of the railing greeting my hand the way it had for decades. Before heading up, I said one last thing, firm, calm, and true. I'm not the burden here, and I never was. Upstairs, the light through the window felt warmer. The house felt like mine again, not because I fought, but because I remembered who I was before grief softened my voice. Before the storm, before the whispers, before the signatures that weren't mine. In that stillness, with the weight finally lifted, I felt my husband's presence again, not as memory, but as assurance. And for the first time in a long time, I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, letting the truth settle around me like a quilt stitched from years of love, struggle, and quiet resilience. The circle was closed, the story complete, and I was standing exactly where I belonged.